Good afternoon, and welcome to Oxford for the latest in our series of webinars, the Oxford Social Finance webinar series. This is in support of our Oxford Social Finance Executive Education Programme, which is coming up in a couple of weeks' time, where we look at how to combine different sources of capital from foundations, from impact investors, and from public sector to address some of the large-scale problems around the world, such as particularly outlined recently by the SDGs. Today we will have the Programme Director from the Oxford Social Finance Programme, Gayle Peterson, in a conversation with Twersky from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and Naina, Batra, who is the Chairperson and CEO of the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network. We will talk through for about 45 minutes or so. It's got some presentations from both of our guest speakers. There will then be opportunity for questions at the end. So I would encourage you to please enter your questions into the question panel, which you should see in front of you on the side, and then we will address those at the end. So at any time that you have questions as we go through, please enter them into that panel. I hope you find this session interesting and valuable, and we'll now pass you over to Gayle. Over to you, Gayle.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. Next slide. So we want to let you see the beauty of Oxford, wherever you are, whatever time zone, evening, morning, and afternoon. And this is, again, a wonderful place for learning, enrichment, and transformation. Next slide. And that the series, our impact series goals are really to understand what are innovations in the field in social finance to the world's most complex issues, and to bring together experts to share groundbreaking ideas and tap the talents of our global network, to really share expertise, to ask questions, and to build our knowledge. Next slide, please. This series is really, I think, very consistent with the Saïd Business School's philosophy of a world-class community coming together to find solutions to have a global impact. And the impact series, this is an opportunity too for our students who are coming to social finance and impact investing, our alums and our new members of our network, to get to know our guest faculty. Both Faye and Naina will be at the social finance program the first week in November, talking about the connection of community feedback and SDGs. Next slide, please. The way we approach our social impact program portfolio is really threefold. We started with impact investing, which is now going into its 9th year. Started our social finance program based on the needs of our community, and then also impact measures is in its 2nd year. So it's an opportunity for us to continually offer opportunities for our colleagues to learn together, see what this package and suite of programs looks like. Impact investing is very deal-centric. Social finance is blended capital to scale, thinking about solutions in the context of SDGs, citywide solutions, countrywide solutions, continent-wide solutions, and impact measures, which really sits within impact investing and social finance, and as the conversation we're going to have today. How do you begin to measure and use feedback as a tool for understanding impact, and why is it the smart and right and only thing to do in the context of social finance and impact investing? Next slide, please. We work in impact investing across the spectrum, from philanthropy with 0 financial returns, but high social returns, to traditional finance, which is market-based returns, and all points in between. And our blended capital approach really knits together opportunities for us to work across philanthropy with social entrepreneurs and with traditional business. Next slide. The approach we take is really putting at the center of all investments, a person who's most vulnerable, the planet that's most vulnerable. We use a UN human security frame so that we begin to understand the nest of and network of problems that vulnerable people face, and opportunities for us to intervene together and knit solutions together. in these various functions, whether it's economic growth, environment, education, food, and those linkages are really important to us. Next slide, please. We talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, and our social finance program allows us to, through case studies and theory and practice, really begin to understand how to make a difference in the 17 areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. And again, we think about it in the context of interconnection, social finance scale, and SDGs. Next slide, please. This is our network. We've reached close to 500 students from almost 90 countries. And as you join our network, this is your community. Next slide, please. So today we're joined again by guest faculty at Social Finance, colleagues and friends, Faye Twersky, who's the Vice President at the Hewlett Foundation. She has vast experience in evaluation, having led the Gates Foundation Evaluation Division. And Naina, Batra, who is the CEO and chairperson of AVPN, Asian Venture Philanthropy Network. They've been working in partnership in the area of feedback and how critically important it is to address in the context of, are we making a difference? What value can be placed on feedback? How does it fit with evaluation and monitoring? And I want, again, often we forget about what's at the center of our investment impact. And we think about the SDGs. There are 700 million people in the world, and we think about SDG eliminating poverty, that live in poverty. We've got 263 million children out of school, 40 million modern day slaves, and 140 million climate migrants. How do we begin to understand whether we're having an impact? How do we evaluate and monitor success? What kind of granularity do we need in terms of the questions that we're asking? And how do we understand whether we're making a difference? And Faye and Naina will talk about their experiences in gathering data, why it's important, and how it needs to be integrated into monitoring and evaluation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Faye, who will then turn it over to Naina, and then we'll go back to your questions. Thank you very much. Faye?
Yeah, thank you, Gayle, and it's great to be here. You know, a key to accomplishing the Sustainable Development Goals is to measure our progress. And I'm going to argue in the next 15 minutes or so that traditional monitoring and evaluation is necessary but not sufficient. Next slide. Evaluation and monitoring have been the traditional two pillars of measurement in the social sector. People talk about M&E as though it was like peanut butter and jelly, one thing. And it has done a pretty good job, I would say, monitoring and evaluation, but not a perfect job. Evaluation, when I say that, I mean independent third-party assessment, has gotten a lot better over time. Next slide. There are many more methodological tools in the evaluation toolbox, everything from the randomized controlled trials, which are highly rigorous, and you can tell with a great deal of certainty whether your intervention is causing a certain result, to much more participatory kinds of evaluation that's meant to inform ongoing program and intervention development. There are many, many different tools in that evaluation toolbox. Similarly, next slide, monitoring, which we define as in-house progress tracking, the kind of real-time tracking of how things are going, has also gotten better. So there are many more analytics and more systems available for all kinds of programs to more easily track attendance in programs, frequency of services, intensity of services, the demographic characteristics of the people you're serving, and so forth. So they have both gotten a lot better over time, but both monitoring and evaluation have fallen short in terms of being human-centered, and the whole sector has been moving much more towards being human-centered, and I think it's time for measurement to do the same. Next slide. So I'm proposing what I'm calling a three-legged stool for measurement, including not just monitoring and evaluation, but putting feedback as the third leg of the stool. And when I say feedback, I don't mean the client satisfaction surveys of old. There are more rigorous ways of getting feedback from the ultimate intended beneficiaries of our programs, people who are getting services, residents and community, and so forth. So what do we mean by feedback exactly? Next slide. Feedback is laser focused on clients' own perspectives and opinions, their preferences, their experiences, their insights, their ideas for improvement that we can only know if we ask. Feedback is about hearing from people whose voices tend to be least heard in our systems. We tend in the social sector to hear a lot from experts, from researchers, from colleagues in the business of providing services, but we haven't done as good a job as we could in lifting up the voices of the people who should matter most. Next slide. How do we do this? We think about a high quality feedback loop as having these 5 different pieces, beginning with design. Design the questions that you're interested in knowing the answers to, collecting the information from the people that you want to hear from, interpreting that information, importantly, responding to what you learn so that it doesn't just go into a black hole, and then closing the loop with the people who gave you the information in the first place. So what did you hear from them? What did you take away? And what are you doing in response? Let me give you an example, next slide, for how this works with one system that we've developed. It's called Listen for Good. It's a very simple and elegant question set, and it has 5 questions. Sometimes in the measurement field, we commit the sin over and over again of over measuring. And in this case, we decided to measure the minimum amount that we needed to really get an insight into what people's experiences are of different programs and services. So this is a question set that borrows from the business sector. The first 3 questions are an adaptation of the Net Promoter System, and the Net Promoter System is a question that is used by businesses of all types, any business who serves customers. And the first question is, how likely is it that you would recommend this organization to a friend or family member? The second and third questions are open-ended questions. What is this organization good at? What could this organization do better? The fourth question, overall, how well has this organization met your needs? And importantly, how often do staff at this organization treat you with respect? These 5 questions have turned out to produce a lot of really rich information for programs and organizations to use. Let me show you a little bit about how the Net Promoter System works. Next slide. The question is on a 11-point scale from 0 to 10. How likely are you to recommend this program, say this tutoring program, to somebody who would benefit from tutoring? And there's a lot of data in the business sector to suggest that if somebody were to answer a 9 or a 10 on this scale, they're considered promoters. So in a business, somebody's a promoter, they're likely to promote your goods, your products, and say, you should go to this store and buy these dried mangoes. They're terrific, and they're likely to promote those products. If they rate between a 0 and a 6, they're likely to be a detractor. They're likely to say, well, that store's okay. I wouldn't rush back there. And if they rate a 7 or an 8, they're passives. They don't feel that strongly about it, but they also don't feel that negatively about it. So we set out with Listen for Good to test the application of this very simple scale in the social sector to see if it would work. It's a very simple calculation that you can do to create what's called a Net Promoter Score. where you take the proportion of people who are promoters and you subtract the proportion of people who are detractors, and you get a number, you get a score, and the score can be anywhere from minus 100 to 100. And the score can be very helpful. Next slide. Because what it allows you to do is create benchmarks for different fields. These are benchmarks that never existed before we began to actually collect participant feedback in different kinds of programs. So you can see here that there different sectors, different verticals have, or people have different kinds of experiences. The health sector, the safety net health clinics, who are part of the Listen for Good pilot, they have a much more positive experience than the people in the educational programs. So if you are a health clinic and you're rating a 75 or an 80, you're doing pretty well. People are having a pretty good experience, typical of that industry. But if you're a health clinic and you're getting a 40 as your net promoter score, then you are not doing so well. There's a lot of room for improvement. And so that comparative data can be very helpful in terms of your own client, participant, customer experience. On the other hand, if you get a 40 and you're in education, you're right where the industry is. And if you're getting a 75, you are hitting it out of the park. So you have probably things to offer other educational programs in terms of how they could do better. So let me walk you through a couple of examples quickly to show you how this actually works. Next slide. One of the organizations to participate in the Listen for Good was the Nurse Family Partnership Program. This is an organization that started in the United States. It is probably one of the most evidence-based programs on the planet. They started as a research study in Elmira, New York, about 30 years ago, to test the idea about what would happen if a nurse visited a first-time mother and stayed with that mother for 2 years. And the results have been tremendous. So there's many different third-party evaluations. This is where the three legs of the stool really come into full bloom here. They found that so many positive outcomes happened. There were better birth outcomes, better parenting outcomes, better breastfeeding outcomes, better early childhood outcomes, and so on. The evaluations were so tremendous that program has been scaling all over the United States and also in other places around the globe. Nurse Family Partnership also has very robust monitoring systems. They have very sophisticated ways of tracking all the nurses' interactions with the mothers, every time they meet with them, how much time they spend, what topics they cover. They track short-term outcomes, very sophisticated systems. But in all these years, Nurse Family Partnership never actually asked the moms how they were experiencing the program. And they were wanting to expand, and they were hitting a little bit of a ceiling in terms of reaching more moms. So they said, well, let's do that. Let's ask them. Let's use this Listen for Good tool. And it was a little bit experimental. Some of the nurses were a little nervous. Were they going to get critical feedback? And the CEO said, you know what? We're going to try it. And so they sent this 5-question simple survey out to 10,000 of the moms through their cell phones. And within 20 minutes, they got back almost 1,000 responses. And the first thing that these moms said when they wrote back was, thank you. Thank you for asking us. It meant so much to them to even be asked for their opinion. These are folks who don't often get asked for their opinions and asked for their feedback. They also said a lot of other things and gave a lot of both positive feedback to the nurses. They actually loved the nurses, but they also had suggestions for improvement that were quite constructive. And they said things like, we'd like to connect with the other moms. You know, we just connect with the nurse, but we know that you work with a lot of other moms too, and we'd like to connect with them. And can you help us set up a network to connect with other moms? And they said, you know, we love the binder of materials that you give us that are printed out, but you know what, we move a lot. And can you put these same materials on an app? because we all have phones. And that organization 3 years ago didn't even know what an app was. And now they have developed an app so that these women can have on demand the same access to the high quality information. Next slide. The Listen for Good feedback was not just it was transformational for Nurse Family Partnership. This is a different example of how the feedback has been used in a very different context. So the Second Harvest Food Bank serves 250,000 people every month in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is one of the wealthiest places in the world, but still there are people who are food insecure. They haven't done the same kind of rigorous evaluation that Nurse Family Partnership has, but they have rigorous monitoring programs. They measure the number of people who come in, they measure the amount of food they give, the number of meals provided, and so forth. But they knew that as big as that number was, that they were probably only serving about a third of the food insecure people in the region. And they wanted to understand what people's experiences were who were coming in, because they know the number one reason why people don't come in for food is shame. And they wanted to understand if people were having a dignified experience or a less dignified experience. And so they used Listen for Good in 10 of their sites. Next slide. And they took a look at their Net Promoter Scores at these 10 food bank sites. And it looks pretty good, right? It looks like the scores are pretty high. But they saw, next slide, that in 3 of these food banks, the ratings were a little bit lower. So they decided to investigate further. Next slide. And what they found was actually some pretty stark differences in these 3 sites between groups of people who had different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So the Latino clients were having a much more positive experience than the Asian clients, who were largely Vietnamese speaking. And then they began to say, well, with this directional feedback, what is going on here? And they began to look at the volunteers, who was serving the food, and they began to look at the nature of the food, and they began to look at the location of the food bank. And then they talked to people, and they made a bunch of changes. So they began to train their volunteers on cultural competency, and they recruited new volunteers, volunteers who spoke the language of the Vietnamese population in the community. They reconsidered their food offerings, and they created a new site located in the community where people were, all in response to the feeling that people were not having as good an experience. This is directly related to their mission of helping people live with dignity. And these experiences are ones that feedback is helping to illuminate all over the US and increasingly internationally as well. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Naina, and she'll share some of the experience that they've been having here as part of the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network.
Thank you, Faye. Very excited to be here and actually share how we have actually tested a pilot program for Listen for Good in Asia, in 2 markets in Asia, and how we want to see our members use the power of feedback. Next, please. So just a little bit about AVPN. AVPN is a member network of funders and resource providers. So we have about 600 members that move capital towards impact. And when we are talking about this capital, we are not just referring to financial capital, but we are also talking about human capital and intellectual capital. AVPN has been around for about 8 years now. And together, our close to 600 members moved about $8 billion towards impact in Asia over the last year. Next slide, please. So just again, a little bit more in terms of our reach. We are across Asia. We define Asia fairly loosely. We look at anything sort of east of Turkey as being in Asia. We have something that we call a deal share platform where our members are able to list opportunities, programs, organizations where other members can invest, can support, can co-fund. And we are physically present in more than 13 markets across the globe. Next slide, please. So just as a background, when I met Faye a year ago and I heard about the Fund for Shared Insights and the Listen for Good program, I jumped on the opportunity to share this with our members in Asia. My personal sense was that Listen for Good was a tool and an approach that a lot of our members who are funders would actually see a lot of value. So the question I actually started by asking was that, does feedback actually help capital create more impact? This slide is actually quite similar to something that Gayle showed earlier on in the webinar. So what we have found at AVPN is that funders and resource providers operate across a continuum of capital, and they leverage a range of tools and approaches to support the social purpose organizations that they work with to grow, to scale, and to become more effective. The type of capital and or the instrument of capital that is deployed depends on where that organization is in its growth story, what its need is, and oftentimes how it is combined with different instruments in order to actually help that capital have a much more positive impact. I also thought it would be very interesting to explore how essential feedback loops are in ensuring the effectiveness of this capital. Social investors cannot deeply understand the needs and experiences of the end beneficiaries and how they are being supported or empowered without the means to hear directly from them. And this is not something that happens on a regular basis in Asia. So we felt that incorporating the voices of those who are least heard enables this capital across the continuum to have a greater impact, as social investors can learn more about opportunities for higher quality and more equitable services that can better address the different needs of different clients. Next slide, please. So we started out by looking at 2 pilot programs that we could do. We looked at one organization in Australia, which is the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, which had partnered with providing support to the Women's Property Initiative. The Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation in Melbourne is Australia's largest independent community foundation. It was set up in 1923 with the vision of organizing and coordinating charitable giving in Melbourne. It currently focuses on 3 priority issues: youth, aging, and homelessness. For this pilot, the Lord Mayor's Foundation chose to work with the Women's Property Initiative, which is a non-profit community housing organization that helps women facing homelessness find permanent and affordable homes and access to supports, and then also advocates with government and policymakers on their behalf. In Singapore, we decided to work with the Expedia Foundation, which chose to partner with Daughters of Tomorrow. So the insights from this pilot, it's a 6-month pilot, and the insights are still coming in, but I would like to share some initial findings. I would also like to point you out in terms of the interview questions, which actually resonate with what Faye talked about earlier in terms of the Listen for Good survey. Next slide, please. So now what I want to talk about is the motivation behind our 2 pilot organizations, our 2 AVPN members who actually chose to participate in this pilot program. The motivation I feel behind it was, the desire to build the capacity of the nonprofit. Both Expedia Foundation and Lord Mayor's saw the pilot as an opportunity to support their partners in building feedback loops within their own programs. It was interesting that they chose partners that they already knew well, who had a track record of prior funding with them. Lord Mayor's had funded WPI for 3 years prior to this pilot, and Expedia had supported Daughters of Tomorrow for the last 2 years. Lord Mayor's also thought that WPI would benefit from this exercise because as Faye just mentioned, it is very hard to get feedback from people who are highly disadvantaged, such as the homeless, and they have never been asked for their opinion in their lives. This pilot actually provided the opportunity to dedicate time and resources to help WPI to do a 360-degree review of their work. Expedia, on the other hand, wanted to build Daughters of Tomorrow's capacity and help them to gather more useful information to improve the effectiveness of their program. Expedia CSR, in fact, actually conducted internal fundraising to pool resources from their employees in Singapore to contribute to the Daughters of Tomorrow. So it would not have been possible to mobilize this sum that was required to do this program if the employees had been unfamiliar with the nonprofit. We also found that both these organizations, Expedia and Lord Mayor's Foundation, saw that there was a great benefit to the power of feedback. As an online travel company and a market research firm, consumer insights are very valuable to Expedia, and data is a very important part of their decision making. So they immediately jumped on and agreed to participate in the pilot. We also found out that charity funding in Australia over the last 5 years has become much more about consumer choice and control. And it's moving away from a paternalistic, sort of almost feudal way of telling people what they need. So they were also very keen to see, and they recognized the inherent value of the user feedback. Next slide, please. So it is interesting when we realized that, what is the value of feedback? I think it's interesting because oftentimes greater importance of the feedback is ascribed to nonprofits rather than the grant maker. However, being able to incorporate the employee perspective into the Listen for Good model actually helped strengthen the proposition for CSR funders like Expedia, who actually care a lot about employee engagement and how their employees perceive the organization. Being able to incorporate this view will actually help the assessment of which projects and organizations to support going forward. So if there is, sort of beneficiary feedback and that can be shared with employees, Expedia felt that it would be much easier to convince them then to participate in the employee engagement programs with that particular nonprofit. For a community foundation like Lord Mayor's, it is actually important to educate their donors on the value of processes like Listen for Good. They felt that their donors needed to buy into the model to prioritize the voice of the beneficiary alongside the fiscal prudence that they take in their funding decisions. Lord Mayor's made a lot of effort to ensure that there are experts in their grant advisory panel who have either first-hand experience or significant knowledge of the issues involved so that their grants are effective. They also have general KPIs in place once the grants have been awarded. But they have not, till this particular pilot, actually incorporated the voice of the beneficiary. And we felt very strongly that until the donors make this a priority, the process to incorporate the voice of the beneficiary will be seen as a luxury. Next slide, please. So how do we actually make feedback more relevant in philanthropy? We started with the hypothesis that feedback loops will be important in improving the effectiveness of capital in driving impact, and that social investors actually need to hear from the end beneficiaries of their support in order to better understand their needs and experiences. What we have seen through these pilots is that there is agreement on the fundamental value of feedback, but there are still some questions on who should be receiving the feedback and who should be responding to it and how. Next slide, please. So there are questions around increasing the appetite for feedback. And to do this, we feel that we need to use feedback more than just an accountability tool between grant makers and nonprofits. Both Expedia and Lord Mayor's foundations agree that feedback is fundamental for the nonprofits they support. But as of now, funders and resource providers are not yet seeing how their engagement would change from directly understanding the end beneficiaries themselves. So they feel that the efficiency and how the service delivery of the nonprofit will definitely increase because they get to hear the voice of the customer, but it is not yet incorporated into the decision-making tool of the funder or resource provider. Therefore, we believe that capacity building and power dynamics between the grant makers and the nonprofits need to be sort of made more equal. Both funders supported the feedback process, and both of them saw the need for their nonprofits to have the capacity to assess and incorporate this feedback into their programming. What they were concerned, however, about was that what would it mean for power dynamics between the end beneficiary and the charity and them if they got directly involved in the feedback process. And that is a question that I think we need to address. We also believe it is important to build grant maker capacity to incorporate feedback into its processes. Because this is important because at this point, we had tried this as a pilot program, and it is not something that is demanded sort of as a matter of course by funders, by donors, or by employees. So what we would like to do going forward is actually use the results of these pilots to demonstrate the value of collecting this feedback and thereby incorporating it into the grant at the very beginning itself. Finally, we think that from the Asia-Pacific pilots, through the lens of both a CSR practitioner and a community foundation, that the dynamics are very different for those organizations. We also feel that the dynamics will be different when we test it in the Philippines at the end of this month for a private family foundation. We also feel the dynamics might be very different for a venture philanthropist in Japan. So it's important to continually test these tools across different sectors and as Faye mentioned, across different organizations and different sites to really get data that you can then compare and contrast to get the best value and the best benefit of collecting this feedback. Next slide, please. So I'm actually very, very excited that, with this journey that has just started in Asia. And it's very interesting to see how this is evolving and, what are the assumptions that are being challenged across the market. I do hope that many of you will join us during the Oxford Social Finance Program to be held between 4th and 8th November to do a deeper dive into the issues of integrating feedback loops in philanthropy and social investment. I'm excited to hear from you in terms of how you see this developing and what you think are some of the factors that we should be cognizant of as an Asian community that is trying to integrate feedback. As I mentioned, we are going to be doing another session in the Philippines around Listen for Good with a group of Filipino foundations and international foundations who are working in the Philippines. Thank you so much. I will hand this back to Gayle now.
Thank you so much, Naina and Faye. That was wonderful. I think it's also really important. Many of our students come from philanthropy, but they're also in the impact investing space and blended capital space. We're moving in philanthropy to public sector funding, to private sector funding. And the scale of the money that's available through those market forces, that capital, is profoundly larger than philanthropy. So one of the things that we've been learning and seeing in our analysis of impact investing deals and blended capital deals is that if community feedback or community voice isn't included throughout the design of an investment and the impact on beneficiaries and the people whose lives you're trying to improve, that actually the deal can have a profound negative impact. So as we think about Listen for Good, how does it apply to, from your perspective, using a business strategy of listening to clients and consumers? How does it apply to the field of impact investing and social finance, where the available capital is much larger than philanthropy? And what do you think the obstacles are that keep philanthropy from actually, and Naina, you talked about this, from taking this very intuitive, the right thing to do, what are the challenges that you see in the impact investing space and the blended capital space where feedback might be appropriate?
Thank you, Gayle. So I think, it's even more important in the social investment / impact investing blended finance space, because, when investors choose to put their money into impact investing, or they direct a portion of their portfolio into impact investing, they are very, very curious and want to know exactly what is the impact that is being generated by their investment dollars. And if you're really going to be looking at measuring the social impact and not just the financial impact of the money that you're investing, incorporating the voice of the beneficiary to whom that impact is directed becomes even more important and much more crucial. So if I am a social entrepreneur or a social business, and I actually can incorporate the voice of the beneficiary and track that and report that back to my investors, I believe that there is a lot more credibility and that is received in terms of the investment, and thereby I do become much more attractive to an investor who is looking at building impact into his or her portfolio.
And I would just add a great example of this, Gayle, actually is the Omidyar network. The Omidyar network has a pretty significant portfolio, impact investing portfolio, where they invest in small, medium-sized businesses in different parts of the globe. And they have incorporated feedback with the group 60 decibels that rolled out of the Acumen Fund recently into all of their investments. And the Listen for Good is very much in a parallel track with 60 decibels. We are very connected with them, and they are doing a very similar kind of approach. They call it sort of these lean impact sprints, but it's very similar to Listen for Good, with all of their impact investing deals. So I actually don't think that there's any tension there. It's exactly the same in terms of the people being served. What is their experience? Are they having a positive experience, a negative experience, and how could that experience be better? It's really very comparable.
Yeah, no, and we work closely with Omidyar, so that's fantastic. So we often get this question: how much does it cost? How much does it cost to incorporate M&E into assessment of impact measure? What kind of impact measures, social finance impact measures, philanthropy takes? What does it cost to actually incorporate feedback into a monitoring evaluation process so that you've got the three-legged stool?
Yeah, well, of the three, feedback is the cheapest.
Yeah.
Evaluation to be done well, and evaluation, as a reminder, the way that we define it at the Hewlett Foundation is fairly common in the field, is third party, to have that objectivity. So third party evaluation, it can be worth it. It's important, but it is expensive. And sometimes the advice on how much to spend on evaluation for any given program can be anywhere from 5% up to 25%, sometimes even more of a program cost. That's pretty high costs. The monitoring systems, can take quite a bit of investment into your technology systems, into the development of those systems, staffing for building them. Feedback, we're the Listen for Good tool. We are now supporting it at a $30,000 grant, but really that's during the development stage. I'm not even sure that it will require as much. It takes some resources, but the simplicity of it, the real-time nature of it, the idea is that any nonprofit will be able to use this tool once it opens up on SurveyMonkey in 2020. So all you really need is a SurveyMonkey membership and a little know-how inside your organization. So it's much, much cheaper than either of the other two.
Fantastic. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve. Steve, you've got some questions from the audience.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for those people who have sent questions in. We've got quite a few in actually, so we'll start on some of those. Yeah, so one of the questions which has come in is really saying who's actually responsible for conducting this feedback, and how would they report it? Do they report that to investors in social capital, to third parties, or to the organisation itself? So who is conducting this feedback? I guess who is paying for it and who are they reporting back to?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, it's like any question a nonprofit faces about who pays for their measurement systems. You know, measurement is not cost neutral. It takes resources. So does the nonprofit budget for that? You know, every nonprofit should have a line item for their evaluation, for their monitoring, and for their feedback, just like they do for rent and utilities and so forth. That it should be baked into the cost of doing business. Funders, especially funders who expect disciplined organizations as part of their grant making, should also provide funding for organizations to do that kind of measurement. So wherever an organization is getting funding from, they should be asking those funders, whether they're private or public, for funding to support their measurement efforts. If they are a revenue generation, where they've got earned income, then they need to budget for using some of that earned income for their measurement, whether it's evaluation, monitoring, or feedback.
So for the pilot program, we actually had the funders actually paid for the pilot program for the nonprofits to collect the feedback, and the feedback was collected in tandem with a trained facilitator, and the facilitator worked with the nonprofit to actually record the feedback of the beneficiary.
Okay, thank you. So another question from Maria this time. So is data gathered directly from the services provider? If so, how can you avoid information bias, specifically when clients are highly vulnerable and might be biased? And related to that, what do you think is an adequate sample size?
Good questions. Getting a little technical. I mean, in Listen for Good, we aim for a response rate of somewhere between 50 and 70%. That's pretty high. Not all of them achieve that, but we support the organizations to try to think about those terms so that you don't just have too much selection bias. What was the other part of that question?
How do we?
Well, there's a related question which has just come in actually that says really about bias in feedback loops. So how do you avoid bias?
Oh yeah, so the other piece of that is, it's an interesting thing. We've actually looked at this question of whether you collect information with unique identifiers or without, with names associated or without. And we always recommend to do it anonymously, that you're going to get a lot more candor. And actually there's an organization that we've been working with, and I'll tell the story of this organization at Oxford. But they have done it both ways. This is an organization, the Center for Employment Opportunities, that works with people coming out of prisons to help them stabilize their lives. They tried getting feedback, and they still do. They have a few different ways that they get feedback. One of them is with people's names on it, so that they can follow up specifically with those people. That's the argument that they make. And another way is anonymous, and they routinely get lower ratings on the anonymous and higher ratings on the ones with names. So there's a real, what we call courtesy bias. There's a courtesy bias in general. That's why the benchmarks are so helpful, because they help you with a comparative sense. Even with the courtesy, still some groups rate higher and some lower. But we do highly recommend that you make it anonymous so that people feel safe and comfortable to share their feedback in the most honest way.
Thank you. A question from Dennis, which came in, Faye, while you were speaking earlier on. So how would you compare this approach with participatory evaluation, i.e. does this feedback go two ways?
Well, participatory evaluation, I think, is a useful method in the evaluation toolbox. So You may remember that it was one of the methods that was listed in the evaluation column. I was saying evaluation is getting a lot better. And for those of you on the webinar who may not know what a participatory evaluation is, it's a methodology of engaging people in a community in the process of generating the evaluation questions, the methodology, getting involved in data collection, interpretation, and application of the findings. So it's in every step of the way to make the evaluation process participatory. And for a certain cases, it's a terrific method, and it can be, in fact, quite empowering for people. It's related to, but distinct from feedback. So feedback, as we've defined it, and as we're sort of talking about it, it's a relatively simple tool that is a little bit lighter than a full participatory evaluation, where you can ask people how are they experiencing something. It takes a couple minutes to complete. You aggregate the information, and now you have a picture of how people are experiencing a program or a service, and you have some more information to think about and say, how can we make this even better for this population? So they're related, but they really are distinct.
Okay, thank you. Another kind of big picture question, I guess. So in the context of global SDGs, how can data be interpreted or used in a coherent and meaningful way, where if you have clients on different continents who have different perceptions on their needs?
So I think when you're looking at that, you're also looking at, how the SDGs are being achieved in different sectors and in different regions. So, I'm not, if we were doing feedback loops and collecting feedback across sort of similar programs, it would be interesting to compare and contrast them. But I think, geographically, we would have to look at them separately, and also depending on the sectors and the programs that you're working on. I do think, at the end of the day, the SDGs, as Gayle started out by saying, are targeted towards lifting people out of poverty, of actually helping improve their quality of life, and thereby actually collecting feedback from the end beneficiary would make intuitive sense, if not anything else.
Great, thank you. I guess one more question from Alice, and then we're probably going to be pretty much up on time. Well, two questions. The first one is this one. So are there any collaborations which we're aware of with corporations to help them reporting to shareholders on ESG impact? Or are these M&E processes mainly used in the non-profit sector so far?
No, I think more and more corporates are looking at reporting on SDG targets, on ESG targets, since that's what you were asking as well. I think at least across Asia, it is becoming mandatory in quite a few of the bourses and stock exchanges that corporates actually report on this. I also feel a lot of stakeholders, ranging from shareholders to customers and employees, are actually asking corporates to report on their performance vis-a-vis the SDGs, and oftentimes making it almost a requirement for them to report on their ESG footprint.
I want to make offer a little caution here about blending too many different measures into one package. That is, so just using the analogy that the woman offered in the question, a business, they might be tracking their net profits. They might be tracking their gross revenues. They might also be tracking customer experience. Customer experience is not the same thing as a net profit or a gross revenue. Those are all three different kinds of measures that tell you different things. Inventory tells you another thing. So business has the corollaries. They might monitor their inventory. They might look at the impact in terms of their profits, and they might look at the customer experience to get insight about why some stores are generating profits and others aren't. So I think it's important not to load everything onto community feedback.
Yep.
It tells you a particular important and underappreciated perspective on an experience and a preference and an insight, but it doesn't tell you everything. You still have to use the other tools in your toolbox.
And I think with that, I'm going to say thank you to Faye and Naina, and also mention that, you know, our social finance program, you're going to get, our colleagues are going to get their hands dirty in really understanding how they can begin to incorporate feedback and feedback loops into their social finance program, and really putting the beneficiary needs first and understanding how this tool can be used beyond monitoring and evaluation. We're also going to talk about what it takes in terms of leadership and the change of behavior within an organization to adopt feedback as part of the DNA of an organization, whether you're a philanthropist, an impact investor, government, or private sector. How that becomes part of your DNA, and again, in the context of viewing the needs of the beneficiary when you're doing social change. So all good. So Faye and Naina, thank you. Steve, do you want to say a few words to close this down?
Yeah, I can just very quickly wrap up. Really just wanted to say thank you, Gayle, for hosting today and inviting Faye and Naina in. Thank you, obviously, to Faye and Naina as well for coming on and sharing your insights. We have had a couple of extra questions as well, which I may pass on if that's okay afterwards with your permission. Really just to say that this webinar is really kind of brought to you as part of our Oxford Social Finance Programme, which is really a 5-day executive education programme which runs each year. We have some alumni of that programme online. We have some people who are joining us as well in a couple of weeks. The next program is coming up in literally 2 weeks' time. We're pretty much full for that at the moment. There's sometimes a little bit of shuffling around in the last week or two. So if you would like to come on that program, please do get in touch. And if we can find space, then we'll put you in for that. Then we have similar programs concentrating on impact investing in March, and on impact measurement, if you would like to go for more of a deep dive into that week in June of next year. So any questions, please send them through to me. You'll receive an email following this. There'll also be a recording of the webinar, so you can go back onto it, and we'll post this on the school YouTube site as well, so you can revisit that. So thanks again, Gayle, over to you.
Thank you. Soon. Hey, we'll see you soon. Naina, we'll see you in Oxford, and thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you everybody for attending, and this is the end of the webinar. Have a great afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.